Good evening, everyone. Hello, welcome. I am Councilmember Hunt, and I call the February 7th Planning, Development, and Environment Committee meeting to order. As a reminder, we continue to have a remote aspect to our meetings. Both staff and members of the public may be participating in tonight's meeting remotely via WebEx. And there are multiple public comment opportunities at tonight's meeting. There is a general public comment opportunity at the beginning of the meeting, or you may make comments after the presentation and committee question and answer periods on tonight's agenda items. I will also introduce my fellow committee members, Council President Walsh and Council Deputy President Hall. The first order of business will be public comment, so I will check in. I will note that there are no members of the public present in council chambers this evening. I'll check in with City Clerk if there are any members of the public online that wish to make public comment. If so, I will read the directions.
Chair Hunt, no one has signed up previously and no one has a virtual hand raised.
All right, thank you very much. As a reminder, you can provide email comments at Issaquah .gov. And with that, we will go to the first order of business, which is approval of the minutes. These are the minutes from the January 24th City Council meeting. Are there any corrections or? Okay. I'll move to approve the minutes from the January 24th City Council meeting. All those in favor say aye.
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 All right, the minutes are approved. With that, we will go to our first and only agenda item this evening, which is Title 18 Land Use Code, ID 1308, and this will be presented by Director Dollywall, Director of Community Planning and Development. Director Dollywall, please take it away.
Good evening, committee members and members of the community who are online. I'm going to quickly share my screen here. Let's see if this will work. Okay, so tonight we bring forth Planning and Policy Commission's recommendation to this committee on Title 18 as well as Shoreline Master Program with the hope for the committee to review it and then finalize your recommendation at the upcoming meeting for full City Council. The direction we're seeking from you all is, do you want any additional edits to PPC's recommended draft or any additional information you may need to finalize your recommendation at the next meeting? Let's see. As you all know, this has been a journey that started in April of 2021. 3 different phases. Many meetings with the boards and commission and the community members, and we are here at council committee review in phase 3. So that's where we're at today. As part of your packet, we have some attachments. We have some policy questions that we had previously walked through with this committee. Then we've brought forth Planning and Policy Commission's recommendation on those policy questions, and they were teased out for the final draft, consolidated draft, based on when either this committee or Planning and Policy Commission asked for additional information. So we wanted to highlight what research was done and what options was selected, or they were informed by some public comments on that particular topic. Also included is the PPC letter with their, a recommendation to you. It also has an attachment of all the different meetings with their agendas, videos, and minutes for the complete record. There's also a letter from Environmental Board and their previous 2 letters that they had written to us. So we had provided responses to Environmental Board on the first 2 letters, as well as the 3rd letter. We did have a response to them, and so we can provide that additional response for this committee in the next meeting. There's the list of Planning and Policy Commission's motions, and attachment E is underlined strikeout of all the changes that were incorporated in the draft since the draft was released. Public comments, we've been maintaining them in this matrix format. For the first 2 phases, we didn't include that with your packet this time, but we have those if you're interested. But this one is a list of all the public comments since the consolidated draft was released. And then, of course, the entire Title 18 PPC recommended draft and the Shoreline Master Program. Title 18, is now organized into 8 different parts. We kind of walked you through the executive summary for each one of them at your last meeting. I'll quickly go over PPC's recommendation on the policy questions, the first 6 policy questions that we had previously informed you all on. And so site-specific rezones, there was discussion about the process, who should make a recommendation to council. Because these are treated now under the code as quasi-judicial matters, they would go to the hearing examiner first as a recommendation and come to city council for approval. There's still going to be a requirement for council to not have direct, ex parte communications with any community members, applicants, or proponents or opponents of the site-specific rezone, but you will still be the decision maker. However, you'll get a formal, report from the hearing examiner. The criteria, Planning and Policy Commission weighed in, made some tweaks to the criteria, and so the updated criteria was included in your packet. The underlined strikeout version is in that attachment E that is that tracked all the changes that were made. And one of the criteria in here relates to growth targets, and it's been changed from what's in the existing code. They still debated that particular criteria. There was amendments proposed, but in the end they passed the current criteria that you have, but they wanted council to take a look at it. Deviations. So when we first shared this information, there were 2, I think, the through block connections and essential public facilities that were missing from that list. So we had a total of 9. Now there are a total of 11 deviations and specific criteria. PPC discussed these. There was a general concern about, are we going to have a code and then we're going to grant out deviations? I think we sort of explained that it's very different from the current AAS, Administrative Adjustment of Standards, to a very specific criteria. So they have recommended this for your review. Outdoor amenity space. I think at this point, the recommendation is 100 square feet per unit. There is an additional 48 square feet of private balcony open space that is in the code as well, in addition to this common outdoor amenity space. Steep slope buffers. So we laid out 4 options. I think there's some questions about the difference between option 1 and option 4. I can get into those details if you want. Yep.
Oh, thank you. That was my question. So on that one, well, would you prefer that I hold my questions until you're done?
We can do that.
Okay, so for that one, it seemed to me that there were multiple cons listed by, so drawbacks listed by staff for the option that was selected by Planning Policy Commission, and then there was one option that was also one option that had a drawback that was the same as option 1. So if you could explain a little bit about
Sure.
why they picked the option they did.
Yeah, so, the first 3 the first one was what we currently have, but we've cleaned up the criteria for doing buffer reductions. You start out at 50 feet, but if your geotechnical engineer says, and the city's geotechnical engineer agrees that it meets all the safety considerations, you can have a minimum buffer of 10 feet. The con listed in this option 1 was this public perception that these buffer reductions are given out all the time, which is true, that we did give buffer reductions. However, they met the safety standards. So the buffers for steep slopes are different than your buffer reduction for a wetland or a stream. It's really based on safety standards. So if you meet the safety standards, there isn't a tie-in for the city to say you need a larger buffer. So we developed the 4th option to address the public perception of, is there a way to have a 50-foot, but your buffer reductions are still reduced to no more than 50, are based on your height of your, if a 20-foot vertical height difference versus a 200 vertical height difference. PPC debated and discussed that, and they felt that as long as the safety standards are met, that's, they wanted to base the decision on the science and not necessarily on the public perception, and so they recommended option 1. And that was our recommendation as well, because there wasn't a real requirement for increasing the buffer that we could base it on science other than the safety factors. Okay. So then the last policy question, that they had us go back and create some additional options was the critical area code for non-conforming structures. And this was informed by the testing, the code testing options that were done, where someone had a patio that they wanted to enclose in a single-family residence. And the code required a critical area study, which is thousands of dollars, but there was an exemption to enclose an existing impervious surface. And so with the Planning and Policy Commission, that fix was made. That was option 1 when they discussed their options. So no critical area study is needed when you're expanding an impervious surface. But then there were 2 additional options that were asked to develop, for us to come back with. And those were, do you, really from a policy perspective to say, do you want to provide some leniency for non-conforming structures to do some smaller upgrades that, with some benefit to the stream or the wetland buffer. So these would only apply for critical areas of streams or wetlands. That you can add an expansion of about 500 square feet. If you already have a structure in between your critical area and, then on the opposite side, on the other side, not closer to the critical area, but on the other side, you can expand about 500 square feet. You still have to do mitigation at 1-to-1 on the buffer, so you get some net gain to the environment. And the 2 options that they considered was, do you want a critical area study, the homeowner or anyone with a non-conforming structure to do a critical area study, or do you want to just grant this without a critical area study? And PPC felt that this would be a requirement to have a critical area study, because you're not only, you're adding more impervious surface. And so you do want to have a planting plan and things like that that would inform where it makes more sense to do your mitigation and such. So 2 recommendations: no critical area study for expansion and impervious surface, also to allow 500 square foot additions to non-conforming structures on the opposite side, so not closer to critical areas, but with a critical area study. That's, yeah.
Okay. Was there a reason that 500 square feet was chosen?
We at one point, we had said 100 square feet versus 500, and I think it was meant to be not a huge expansion, but, 20 by 25, someone wants to add a room or a deck or something like that. I think that's where 500 came from, more for homeowners, kind of a setback, but there wasn't a lengthy discussion or debate of what square footage makes the most sense.
Okay. I think kind of some of my thoughts on that are just that if we're getting really good mitigation on an area that we wouldn't otherwise, and we're getting it in a 1-to-1, I would just like to be able to maximize that to all effects possible. So it would be nice if it was maybe related to a percentage of the critical area buffer that could be improved or something like that, or whether there's an average edge of a property on one of these that might justify. I think the 500 is probably fine, but I wonder whether we're leaving things on the table there.
Was there a question, or you just?
No, I just went off,
Okay.
sorry.
Okay. I did have a follow-up question on this one. So is it possible, we generally, if you have a non-conforming structure, you don't, my understanding is we don't allow for it to become more non-conforming with improvements. In fact, it has to go the other way. And so doesn't this allow for a non-conforming structure to expand into an area that they wouldn't otherwise be able to build in?
Correct. So if you, it goes beyond what's currently allowed as a non-conforming structure, but I think it recognizes that you have non-conforming structures in the city and they're not going to, you can, so the policy question is we could let them maintain and upgrade, but keep the footprint the same. And that's in the existing code, you're allowed to maintain and upgrade. I think some of the requests were to go beyond that. And so these these options were developed related to that. To answer the question of why 500 should be, if you're getting, so you get some buffer enhancements that you wouldn't otherwise. So that's the trade-off of letting people do. But cumulatively, you may increase your impervious surface more in the buffers. So that's where I think 500 seems like you start off, and if everyone's doing 500, how much does that cumulatively add up?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Those were the 6 questions that we previously discussed with you all. But during the PPC deliberations, some of the public comments that informed some other discussions that were had and options laid out were these 5 additional ones. The first one was a technical document review. So what this is in our current, in the proposed draft, this was a type of a review that was added for 2 reasons. One was we want to be able to give people an answer on what's the buffer on your property. And we can't do that without getting a technical review of the wetland report and say, this is type 1, your buffer is 100 feet. So we want to give people answers early in the process. The second part was Development Commission felt that they were not subject matter experts on these very technical geotechnical reports and wetland reports, that they brought value to the process by providing input into the building design, the site design, as opposed to these technical documents. So we created this technical document review as an early process. People don't have to do this. They could bundle everything and we would process it as a level 4 site development permit if that's what they need. But if they wanted an earlier answer to some of these questions, we could do a technical document review for them. So the policy questions were, should it be level 1 or level 2? The difference between level 1 and level 2 is they're both administrative. Level 1 is your building permit. If you want to build a deck, you want to build a house, you don't, it's a level 1. We don't circulate a notice. There's no notice board, none of that. Level 2 requires a notice and things. So, but the decision maker and the appellant body is the same. So Planning Policy Commission recommended level 1. Public utility exemptions were listed as level 1 in the draft, and their recommendation is to change it to level 2. Master site plan discussion came from public comments, and these are no longer in your proposed draft. So master site plan in the past, as you remember, the school project or some parks projects many decades ago had gone through a master site plan process that was approved by council, by ordinance. And since, council being a body that's making decision on quasi-judicial matters was one of the goals, to not have that be the best practice. So we've eliminated the master site plan. It's just called a site development permits that are approved by the Development Commission. But we wanted to recognize if there was an existing master site plan and someone wanted to amend it, what is the criteria for that? So we carried forward the criteria for major versus minor. However, we clarified that criteria. The existing criteria in the existing code is there a substantial increase in building height, or is there a substantial increase in the impervious surface? But it's very subjective. What is substantial? So we clarified that to say, if you are increasing your building height by more than 10% of what was previously approved, you still have to meet the new criteria and the new code, but it can be processed as an administrative decision. If you're going beyond 10%, then you have to go back to the Development Commission. The criteria for evaluation remains the same, it's just the process is different. So Planning and Policy Commission said, yes, they're fine with the clarification of the criteria for adding that percentage, but add the phasing language for projects, allow phasing for projects that are over 15 acres or more. The other question that, there were a lot of questions on the non-conforming chapter. So that's your, what you grandfathered in and really if you, and there are special things for if you're within a wetland or a stream buffer, but generally, and then you have, if you burn down or there's an earthquake, what are your grandfathered rights? So none of the policies changed in that chapter in the new draft, in the proposed draft. However, we've cleaned up into those different categories. So I think Planning and Policy Commission didn't make any additional changes to the proposed draft, except for the one about the expansions of 500 square feet allowed that we just talked about. The last question that was sort of discussed was site development permit. Right now, the language in the proposed draft says new development or redevelopment triggers that, a site development permit, and there are different thresholds. Up to 4,000, it's level 2, and over 10,000 is level 4. And the question was, what if your redevelopment is 50% of the value of the property, of the building? So what if you're just doing interior work and you trigger that 50% threshold? Do you still need a site development permit? I think in the proposed draft, we made it clear that interior, remodel, it doesn't trigger it. However, the definition of redevelopment conflicts with that. So I think we got direction from PPC that, make it clear that interior improvements, regardless of the value, don't necessarily trigger site development permit. The non-conforming chapter will dictate, and that the threshold is 75%. So if you don't meet your setback or don't meet your, any other standard, you can do those improvements, but if you do more than 75%, you have to bring it into compliance. So that was the policy question discussion. And then I think the rest of the packet captures their other discussions or concerns that they had. So we had 3 public hearings on the consolidated draft, and we are here today. We have another planned meeting with you all on February 28th, and we can, schedule times with City Council on March 13th, April 17th, and then it'll go into effect, after Council's adoption. But at this point, I think we're thinking if any changes that the committee makes or any new edits that might come in, that we would hold one public hearing with the Committee of the Whole to capture that. And I think that concludes my presentation. I think the only other thing I would add to that is, since the Planning and Policy Commission hearing, we captured some of the things that came in the public comments. One of them relates to this redevelopment piece, that we can bring forth a revised draft that clarifies some of the language for that. The other one is critical aquifer recharge area and prohibited uses list. So we have some proposed language in the public comment matrix that we can bring in with the next committee's packet. And I think there was one addition, the transfer of development rights. I think there's still some questions outstanding on that. So if the committee wants some additional edits, or based on our review, if there's anything additional needed on the TDRs, we can include that in the next packet. The other thing, the environmental board had some questions, and I think we had a good meetings with them. They really took a deeper dive on some of these things. Overall, I think they wanted you to hear directly on some of the items. I'll touch base on a couple things that I think I got as questions. Common line setback and removal of bulkhead incentives. They were wondering if that could be applied to other shoreline master, to the streams. And we identified that that doesn't, it doesn't, that those provisions didn't apply to anything. They were only for Lake Sammamish and the existing SMP, and those have been taken out. So I think that question was just clarification for them. The other one, carbon sequestration, they wanted some recognition of that in the purpose section, so we can propose an edit and include that. The last one, I think, was reconsider allowance of non-native plant species in wetland buffer. I couldn't find that, but the discussion, it may have been in an earlier version of environmental board's comments, but the discussion at the last meeting they had, which was a good point, I think, was the code says anytime you're in the buffer, you have to have this native plants, but there was a concern from the board, one of the board members, that's in your letter as well. What if you are in a very urban environment, like a street tree or a parking lot? So those native plants will not be successful, that perhaps there should be an out for those kind of circumstances. So we'll look at that and maybe propose some edits. We can bring forth any edits that environmental board wants in your next packet.
I can clarify that one because that was one of my questions that I emailed in. So it's from the March 16th, 2022,
Okay.
which was in our packet, but those minutes, and it says it's under wetlands, so maybe 3 or so pages in, and it says the last one under wetlands is reconsider allowance of non-native plant species in the wetland buffer. And generally, I was just wondering if we could get a response to these. They had some other good points, like you mentioned, the carbon sequestration. So I think that would be helpful, because I had a number of questions about things they raised, but could maybe all be taken care of by having the responses.
Sure, yeah, we'll include that in the next, but we did provide them a response, so the letter that you currently see is not that, we were able to answer a bunch of these, but they felt like they needed to kind of bring that forth, so.
President Walsh?
Yeah, so on that, do you expect that you'll be bringing back a list of the environmental board suggestions that you're then going to incorporate into the code? And then also let us know if there's any that that the administration doesn't agree with, so that we can make sure, I want to make sure we close out
Sure.
everything, because these were fantastic, detailed, wonderful reviews and edits. So I really just want to make sure
Absolutely,
we
yeah.
have a
In
particular
your
touch point.
packet is this other, if I can find it, there is, we included a list of changes that we've incorporated, and in there is one that we've already made those edits. But this remainder of the letter from environmental board, so I think we gave you a list of edits that we've already made based on environmental board's comments, but there are some other ones from here. So we'll provide a response to all of these, and if there's edits to be made, we'll make them.
Okay, yeah. Similarly, I just wasn't sure where to find if it had already been addressed for a number of them. So I think having that response list would be super helpful for these.
Will do.
Council President Walsh?
So, two things that kind of came up that I know PPC made a recommendation on, but I'm almost feeling like these are substantial enough ideas that I might want to put them to the whole council. And so I just wanted to bring up the outdoor amenity space. PPC recommended increasing it from the 48 square feet to 100 square feet, which puts us in line with a lot of the other cities. But I know we're also looking to have a conversation about housing affordability and what other changes we could make. I don't yet have a clear understanding of how much this would add to the cost of development, and whether it would put any projects out of reach. So I almost want that type of analysis, and whether that happens now or when we do the missing middle conversation, I'm not sure, but I wanted to bring that up because I don't know how to effectively make a decision on that other than just saying it's what other cities do, but we also do parks really, really well. So I don't know, is that something that we feel like we could address or do some kind of analysis on? Or I guess for the other council members, do we feel like this is something to go to the full council or?
Okay, so I think the first question was for Director Dhaliwal, if that would, what your thoughts are on doing an analysis like that, and then, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you're asking for like an economic analysis of, the cost, what does it do to the affordability of the project? I think it makes more sense to look at comprehensively all the development standards for that. What does parking do? What are our parking requirements and all of that? So not just a piecemeal kind of an assessment, perhaps, is more appropriate. And you'll see some of that with the inclusionary zoning, research that we're doing with the Happy Grant. But we can do whatever you think is necessary.
Yeah, just I appreciate grouping those together and having a comprehensive conversation on it. I guess I would just talk to my fellow committee members. Do we feel like it's appropriate to make this change, or does it make more sense to leave it as is until we can make that change?
Well, great question. I think maybe we should save that for our deliberation because we have to do public comments as well, and then we'll go to deliberation. Do we have any more questions? I have two more. Okay. Two more questions. One is in public comments, there was a concern raised about tenant improvements subject to level 2 review. I believe this was addressed in PPC, and we think that comment has been addressed, but I just wanted to check in.
Yes, so I think that particular comment is addressed, and I think that commentator is satisfied with the response. We are still going to bring forth a cleanup of the code language to make it explicitly clear for interior tenant improvements, and then just a facade change. So if you have a building that you're just changing the facade, what level of, that should just be a building permit, so it's a level 1 as opposed to an expansion. So, and that turns into that site development permit. So we can propose some language for the next draft on that topic.
Okay. The other one is if you could review what happened since this committee last saw this with regards to the zero lot line code, because that was a little bit confusing. Went through a few iterations, confusing for me anyway. Describe that.
Yeah, so, we had the zero lot line provisions in the code initially, and I think during the first round of public hearing, so the question was raised, where all should these zero lot lines be allowed? There was some confusion between what is a zero lot line, so we tried to, add definitions and clarify all of that. So basically what these are they don't change your density, they don't change your lot size. Your zoning allows where homes and lot sizes, but it provides another flexibility to shift your home on one side of your lot, not your exterior lots, on the interior side of your lot, for someone on a small lot to have a 10-foot side yard setback that becomes a more usable space than have 2 5-foot with a fence in between. I think this committee said go back to Planning and Policy Commission and have that discussion of where it should all be allowed. The direction we got from PPC at that time was to allow it in Central, Talus, Highlands, and small lots, single-family lots that have a minimum density of 7.26 dwelling units per acre. So that was in the proposed consolidated draft. Since that time, some of the membership of the PPC changed. We have a few new members, but an existing member proposed it as an amendment during this last go-round, and that recommendation was changed to only allow zero lot lines in Central, Highland, and Talus, and the language about allowing it in single-family small lot was struck out. So there was a question about which areas of the city are zoned single-family small lot, that's South Cove and some other areas. And so based on their understanding of which areas these were, and perhaps not fully understanding that it's not changing your density or your lot size, they switched their recommendation.
Quick follow-up, staff's recommendation on that would be was to have the small
Correct.
lots in there.
Yeah, because we felt it was just an additional option for folks. It didn't change. And then I think there was some public comments about, have we notified South Cove and what does it mean and all that. And so I think it's just when we get a plat that so it's not a single family existing lot that can go in and put their house on a corner, on the property line. It would be only when you propose a plat or short plat or something that you have this flexibility. At that time, there would be a notification to the surrounding property owners, and we would kind of explore the options. And it won't, it's just these internal lines, lot lines, that you would have a way to situate your home to make better use of land.
That was my questions. Have any other questions? Great. Thank you. I will at this time note that we still have no members of the public in council chambers. The city clerk, if there are any members of the community online that might wish to give public comment at this time.
Chair Hunt, we have a couple of online attendees. Give them a moment to raise their hand if they'd like to speak.
Okay, and I do have some directions if anybody would like to speak.
No one has raised their hand, Chair.
All right. Well, remind again, if you have any email comments, we are at citycouncil@issaquah.gov. We will move to deliberations. We have a number of sections that we could deliberate one by one, or what is the thoughts on that?
I'm not sure I need to go one by one. I'm feeling really good about PPCs, but I'm happy to go down my full list. But if you want to go one by one, I'm happy to.
I feel similarly. So I will start off by making sure to say last time we had the staff come and speak to us about all of the hard work that you've done. That was really great. And this time I wanted to make sure to thank our commissions who have worked so hard, 35 plus meetings and many hours, and both the PPC as well as the environmental board have thoughtful comments, and I think have an excellent job. I really benefited from their review in reading through, and wanted to make sure to thank them so much for their time, and really value their contributions and their time that they volunteer to do this. With that, I also just had a few things that I wanted to discuss with this committee. So would you like to go ahead and do your, okay. So the first one was the housing target criteria. That was in the rezone. We have struggled a bit with this in the past, especially when it was less clear. It has been clarified. My thoughts on this are that I don't know that this is really meant to be a criteria for a rezone. It's also not within our control. We're using county growth targets, and I think that when I look through that list of criteria, that one stands out to me as unlike all of the others. The others are sort of judgment calls and about benefits to the community and about the neighboring properties and things like that I think we could tick through, and this one stood out as different. So I would propose to remove that one, but I wanted to check in with council committee.
Yeah, that also stuck out for me, and looking at the PPC debate and the fact that it came out 2-5, I think knowing the politics that goes into creating that number at the county level, while it is a target, our development and the idea of a read zone shouldn't be limited by that. So I think we have great criteria that apply to a particular area of the city that we can really make the judgment calls over whether this would serve a higher level of development. And I don't think we need that option to be about the countywide housing targets. So I would agree with that.
Thoughts on that one?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I wrote that down too, I was thinking similarly, but I think maybe it's a question to pose to council. I don't think we necessarily need to pull it out right now, because I think there are some questions in terms of what, like, I would like to know what other communities do. This is a common criteria. And then also there's kind of a broader policy discussion to be had about the increased housing diversity goal, and then in the desired outcomes within that, and making sure that, you know, our criteria are aligned with that. So maybe we can have that kind of broader discussion and tee that up for the full council.
Okay. I think, well, first of all, I'll check in with Director Dhaliwal. Do we have an answer? My understanding was that other cities have different criteria, but not necessarily using this housing target. It's our city attorney
Yeah,
is
we
shaking
didn't find
her hand.
anything, but there's some legislative history with why it came about. And I think the debate with PPC was that when are you going to actually, this is a 20-year target. So if you're in year 18, then maybe you will have met that criteria. So there is no other city that has this criteria, if that's over. But there's some legislative history in Issaquah that debated this criteria, and it's there. We've tried to clarify it, but we kept it. But if it needs to come out, it can happen now.
Okay, so no other cities have this criteria. Is there a, yeah. It seems to me that is another reason to not do this. We don't want to be the only city that has a certain rezoning criteria in the county, or known. Yeah. So I think posing it to council would make sense. This does affect our decision-making process. All of council will weigh in and will be using these criteria. So I definitely think as a flag for council, but I would be comfortable recommending, based on our previous conversations and based on this conversation we've just had, I would be comfortable recommending as this committee that we remove that one.
Yeah, I would agree with that idea of going ahead and removing it. But I think we're starting to get into some of these policy questions that should come before the full council. And so one of the ways to do this, I think, would be really nice to show, here's our current criteria, here's the proposed criteria, as just a way to tee up some of these conversations for the full council, so that they can make some effective decisions, especially when we are going to be the decision maker on those.
Sure. So if I understand it correctly, the entire number 2, because number 2 criteria has, you're allowed an up zone, basically, increase in housing density if you're located in the regional growth center, or if you're outside the growth center and the growth targets have not been met. So are you just striking out 2B, or are you striking out the whole C? And then the C is, if the council approves the development agreement concurrently with the rezone proposal. So is it just take out 2B or take out entire 2? That's something you all can discuss.
Would it be possible to put it up on the screen
Sure.
if you're looking at it. Thank you.
Madam Chair, just from a process perspective, I'm not sure if you wanted maybe just to start keeping a list of the council issues rather than try to resolve each one as you come through them. Because I think we're going to want to make sure at the very end of this that we walk through what that council meeting looks like. And so we're happy to do it however you think is convenient, but if you'd rather just kind of put a little bit of a pile of things to come back to, that works as well.
Yeah, thank you, City Administrator. Yes, I think makes a lot of sense. I think just because for this one, we started walking down the path of what is a recommendation.
I don't want to stop you walking down your path.
Close it out, but
I
then
just-
we can, yes, I agree. And I sort of have a list. It sounds like we have some other
As your
items.
colleagues, this is going to be overwhelming. And so I think they're depending on you to come up with nice bite-sized chunks to the greatest extent possible for them.
Okay, thank you. So for this one, I think I would suggest removing item 2. I think there's lots of other criteria here that are judgment calls, and it sounds like are more similar to what other cities use for rezoning. I will check in, though, with our city attorney if that sounds reasonable.
Yes, I think that's reasonable.
Great, okay. Is this committee ready to move to the next item? Okay. Councilmember Hall, you had an additional question about aligning with missing middle, or I wasn't sure I caught that.
It was just to reinforce the point we were just discussing. So one of the desired outcomes in that is across the city, there are a variety of housing types. So recognizing, obviously, we want there to be built in central Issaquah and in that area, but one of our desired outcomes that council has already identified is across the city, so.
Great, got it, okay. So my next one was, I generally feel like the code around non-conforming properties is to allow them to continue to be non-conforming to the extent they are, but not to further become even more non-conforming. And so especially for the wetland buffers and for the fact that we have buffers to protect the streams and the wetland areas and environmental stewardship, that change, which was a change that was recently made, that change did not resonate with me. I think allowing further building in the within the buffer, which this would allow, would not necessarily be offset by making enhancements. And generally, it just seemed like it was counter to our usual way of addressing the non-conforming structures in code. So I flagged that one. Would like to hear what other committee members think.
So I guess maybe I didn't understand this. I was assuming that if there was a wetland buffer area on, say, one side of the property and you've got a house there, it was less likely, or maybe even not likely, that, let's say, the front of the house where there would be proposed building would be still in the buffer. But it sounds like maybe I was wrong on that.
Yeah, so that could be one scenario where your house is in the buffer, but then you're outside the buffer. That, you don't need a change in the code, that you can already build outside the buffer. If your entire house is in the buffer and additional land is in the buffer, do you want to allow some expansions, is I think what this amendment was getting at.
Do you have a sense of how common that is, just citywide? Like,
I mean, it could be common, and, the stream buffers are going up too. So something that is not non-conforming now could become non-conforming with the rules, so. And so it's just, the buffer's already interrupted, I think was the thought process there, that you're not, you already have your critical area and there's already a structure in between. So therefore, the criteria was to kind of weigh in and get some gain out of it, but give some more flexibility. But as long as you're not taking down any trees, because that could still be a habitat value for the buffer, so that's, I think, the thought process there, that it's already interrupted by a structure.
Is this something that other cities do?
Yeah, I think there's generally some provision for flexibility for single-family homeowners, at least. I think in our case, it would sit in non-conforming structure, so it would apply to any structure which we feel like you can't have, if it's but it would only be if your structure is non-conforming. So you can't just go and build into a buffer if there's no existing structure. So, so it would limit to who all can take advantage of this. Would be you already have a non-conforming structure. You could limit them to that same footprint and not allow any expansions as a policy, or you want to allow some flexibility, but in response, in exchange, want to have some plantings and things like that along the stream or a wetland.
Okay. I appreciate that you've brought this up. I think this sounds like an interesting topic, and I appreciate the idea of, I don't know how many structures this applies to or how much of an impact that is. So I'm not sure quite what to do with it, but I think it's a good set of questions or conversations.
Okay, so we'll add it to the list. I'll just note that it also we didn't used to have this in code, or in the current Title 18, this is not allowed. So this is allowing additional building in these buffers. Seems counter to the point of the buffer to me. It also reminds me a bit of the common line setback conversation, where it was like, if you already have structures in next to, closer to Lake Sammamish than they're supposed to be, if your neighbor is there, you can build out to that line, because it's already, which never made sense to me. So this one, as I said, does not resonate with me as something we need to add to our code. But we will add it to the list, unless there's, okay, we'll add it to the list. All right, my last one is on the zero lot line. I think, to be brief, I think that I would recommend that we recommend the staff's recommendation, which was to also allow it in these smaller lots, so higher minimum density neighborhoods, because it just allows you to have a little bit more flexibility with how you're building your home, and more efficient use of the land in those areas. And I agreed with the previous conversation that PPC had on that, where committee members spoke about living in that kind of neighborhood and the benefits of being able to build to the lot line. And I still support that. So I would recommend going back to that recommendation.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I live in a house that's built to the edge, and it gives me a little 5-foot yard, and I very much appreciate that, rather than having 2.5 feet on either side. And I think, given that this is tied to the small lots, it absolutely makes sense.
Okay, great. Thoughts?
Do we think that's a change that we can just make, or something to tee up and add to that pile?
I feel comfortable making a recommendation on it. It's a very technical one, so I think it would be helpful for us to have a recommendation on that one.
Yeah, and does our current code, how does it address zero lot lines?
Yeah, we don't have a provision for zero lot lines right
Yeah,
now.
okay.
So this was an added, section in the subdivision chapter. Yeah.
But we do have neighborhoods built
Correct.
out that way. Talus and the Highlands are built out that way already.
That's correct.
So that's the kind of houses that are
Yeah.
majority.
Yeah, I feel comfortable making that. Yeah, I think there are a lot of other policy ideas that we'll really want to address with the full council.
All right. My last one was actually a question that I forgot to ask earlier. So one of the additional deviations that I believe was added or recommended to be added by PPC was the deviation of essential public facilities, and was the location.
Yeah,
Can you
you know,
s-
actually, it didn't come from PPC. We
Oh.
just missed it in the list. It was always in the code.
Okay.
But then the section that listed all 9 was missing this one for through block connections and then the essential public facilities. So that already existed in the code, but the list was missing those 2. So we just wanted to highlight that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Then no, I guess I don't have a question on that one. That was my list. Council President Walsh.
Yeah, so you guys have already addressed many of the points that I had, but the other one I just want to make sure is on there is that outdoor amenity space. Whether we want to keep it at the existing 48 and then do the evaluation, or whether we want to increase to the 100 square feet, which is what PPC recommended, though in their letter and the environmental board's letter, they both said, hey, we're not addressing this missing middle piece. So I know both of them are very much looking forward to that portion. So my preference would be to keep it at the 48 square feet so that we don't have unintended consequences until we do that analysis. But I don't know what the preference is, or whether that's something to bring to the full council.
Okay, so that, just to clarify, the 48 feet, that is in the current code, is that?
Yeah, so the 48 square feet comes from central Issaquah standards. Talus and Highlands have a requirement for new parks at the ratio of 250 square feet per unit that we have carried forward in this draft. The other parts of the city that aren't central didn't have a standard. So there's that aspect of, I think, just this getting all the pieces together in one location. So we carried in the table, if I have it here, I can bring it up. But it breaks it down, you know, it says, and so I think that the conversations with the community members and with PPC were common outdoor and common private outdoor. I mean, private outdoor spaces. So the private outdoor spaces are the 48 square feet. The question, the concern, if we leave it at 48, was in the existing code, you could just put a balcony on each of the units and you've met your common outdoor space requirement. You didn't have to provide anything beyond that. However, you know, they felt like there needs to be some common outdoor space. People shouldn't just get to pick the balconies, but balconies are nice, so balconies should remain. In addition, you want to have outdoor common open spaces. So.
Based on that explanation and the difference between the 250 and not having it, I guess I'm probably comfortable with going forward with the 100 square foot recommendation and then just putting that as part of the whole cost analysis. Yeah.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think we don't want unintended consequences either way, but we do want community space and want to make sure that there's community space for the communities that live there. So I think I would err on that side. Okay. Did you have additional items? No. 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 Okay. that was our list of items. I will say again, thank you so much for the very thorough documentation, and also thank you again to the commissions for their super hard work.
So I guess the next question is what's next?
Right, so we did identify that it would be helpful to have the response to the environmental board things, environmental board's concerns with sort of in the response format, so the concern and then the response, whether it's been addressed in the draft or not, and if it has, how it's been addressed, and if not, why. That'd be great.
In a memorandum form?
Memo, yeah.
Okay.
I think, or table, whichever you
Okay.
prefer. And
So we have a meeting scheduled, is it the 28th?
28th,
The
February
28th of February, so a second meeting this month. So if we bring that back to you, and then also perhaps a draft of what a presentation to the council would look like, and those would be the two items then for the 28th, and then if you're satisfied with both the analysis from the Environment Board as well as the presentation, then we're done at Planning, Development, Environment.
I think so. Looking for nods.
Yeah, I'm just looking over the planning calendar, and it looks like we currently have it set to go to the Committee of the Whole on March 13th.
And that's the next question.
Yeah, I was going to say, does the February 28th give you enough turnaround time on that?
Well, I think if the presentation that we would bring back on the 28th is generally acceptable to you, then that's what we would put on the Committee of the Whole on the 13th. We do also want to start reaching out to the council, the other 4 members of the council, to provide briefings. And I think at this point, Minnie, we know what we need to tell them.
Sure,
And so we
yeah.
will start, I know there's some vacations, midwinter breaks, all that coming up in the next few weeks. So we can start the process of offering those briefings now, even prior to your final discussion on the 28th of February. So are you feeling confident as you sit here this evening that that March 13th would be a one-touch at the Committee of the Whole? Because right now we do not have a second one scheduled for the month of March. The City Clerk's office was looking at dates pending your discussion this evening. If you felt we needed to do that, I think it was at March 27th. March 27th, we would propose to the council as a second Committee of the Whole. But we didn't want to do anything before the discussion this evening. So what's your thoughts?
Is the current plan to have one touch at a Council of the Whole and one touch then to adopt it at a regular meeting?
I think we're looking at 2 touches at a regular meeting, because I think
Okay.
with the attorneys, and I think just common sense, are proposing that we would do a public hearing.
Yeah, I think the dates I have from were March 13th and April 17th, but there's a March 27th?
Well, if there was a second, now this is the second
Okay.
Committee of the Whole.
Got it.
So I think the April date would be the first meeting at the councils. That, I don't have the calendar.
Yes, the April 17th meeting would be the first council meeting with a public hearing, and then May 1 would be a regular council meeting adoption.
So 3 touches with council, April 13th,
Right,
Committee of the
2
Whole.
council meeting touches and 1 Committee of the Whole touch. So the question really for this evening is, does your gut tell you that's okay? If there's any hesitation, fine, but we would like to start polling the council for the March 27th date.
Okay, my instinct is that I think this is in a really good place. I think it's really well documented, the changes that have been made, and the goals and outcomes have been really well documented, how we've addressed them. I think presenting that to council, to full council, will be organized similarly well. Everything has come together really well, is my point. And so I think that schedule sounds good as is. I think 3 touches is also, meets the 2-touch standard, so plus 1 touch, I think that's good.
Yeah, I was just going to totally agree, although I don't know if I have a clear sense of like what are all the kind of policy questions that we're teeing up for council. I mean, there are a couple that we added to the pile today, but since coming onto the committee, I don't know if you guys had kind of talked through some questions previously that might be added. And I know it might take a while to go through the goals and outcomes chart with responses too. And I know council will want to focus on that. But, you know, do we have a list of everything else?
Well, and I think we're proposing to come back on February 28th with the full presentation that I guess we would hope that you would help with your colleagues at the Committee of the Whole then in March. So February 28th, we would come back with what we consider the full list, and then you tell us, have we got it or not? So the Committee of the Whole, we're currently proposing 90 minutes for the meeting on March 13th. There is a second item that we're proposing for 60 minutes to talk about City Hall space planning. Okay, I'm not trying to talk you into more meetings. We're at a point in the calendar that we just need to ask the question. So we will not poll for a second Committee of the Whole. We'll go with the one that's scheduled on March 13th. We'll come back to you on the 28th with the Environment Board information as well as a draft presentation of what the Committee of the Whole looks like, and we should be good.
I think that sounds good. I will also make my regional report and, you know, sort of let council know where this committee is in our process at that regional report. And I think between that and the individual sessions that are being held with staff for council members, I think I would guess that is good.
I mean, we're feeling good too. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that.
Yeah, I think it'll be good for us to know what your thoughts are. You know, you've touched it many times with the first round, and so with the council coming in with this big thing, where you think would bring value to them? I mean, where do we start? Do we start with the executive summary and the goals and outcomes chart, and then, or you have other thoughts or ideas about what to include in the present? We'll bring the draft presentation for you to weigh in, but if you have feedback for us, what to include in that presentation, that would be helpful.
Okay. My first thought is I think it'd be great to do a high-level summary of all the work that has gone in. We, as our committee, have seen that. We've gotten these recommendations. We know, you know, planning policy had 35 meetings. So just a summary of planning policy had 35 meetings. We had this many community meetings. We had this many public comments that we've addressed individually and tracked. I mean, it's been a huge amount of work, and I don't want that to. I think starting with that is good. And then I think the goals and outcomes chart really sets the stage well. I think it has been very clearly laid out how we've addressed those items, and the ones we haven't addressed are the ones that are teed up for future work. So I think that's my recommendation. Do we have other recommendations? And then we have a couple items that we want to raise for additional consideration. Do we have other thoughts on what should be included in that presentation? Yeah.
Yeah, I will second all of that, and just say that I found the executive summary very helpful. I think that it will be a little bit difficult during a meeting to talk about, you know, part one is general provisions, and, you know, this part is zoning and all of that, and really to understand that, but to be able to point out those areas that are particularly new, that were added based on either we were doing it for best available science or we were doing it because of the goals and outcomes chart, would be really useful. And then the areas that maybe had the most changes would probably be a good one to highlight. And other than that, I would probably utilize the executive summary as content for council, but I don't know if going through one by one on all of those things would be as helpful at the meeting.
Maybe also too, actually I can't remember if this is described in the executive summary, but some statement or description of the code testing work that was done to just to assure council members that, you know, that was thought through where possible. And then also just a ditto to kind of, the goals and outcomes chart is pretty lofty in some places, and the scope of this particular update doesn't always meet that loftiness. And so recognizing that this is this scope, and we've got the whiteboard items teed up and coming up, and making sure everyone's reminded of that.
Right, no, I think that's helpful.
Any additional thoughts, comments? Council President?
I know the stormwater, the SMP was also part of the meeting or part of what PBC reviewed. Is there anything that we need to go over for that?
The Shoreline Master Program?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, no, I think we've included the summary in the previous packet. So some of that direction came from you, from the council, in order to, the last update from 2019 identified some things that were left undone. So we've included those, and mostly it's the common line setback is no longer, just because your neighbors have it closer to the lake, you don't, that's gone away. There used to be an incentive for removal of the bulkhead. That has gone away, and you're just required, if you're building a new house, you do need, nobody really took that incentive, wasn't used except for ones, I think, in the last few decades. The dock lighting provisions were added, and then the other substantive changes, the critical areas code update will be the new appendix to SMP. So they will both align, because it's Department of Ecology has to approve our Shoreline Master Program. So as you make your final recommendation to ecology, then ecology will make the final decision on the shoreline SMP. So there may be,
Thanks.
Yeah.
There's attachments A through H, and so, just occasionally like to check in on those extra ones.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I noted that in the environmental board's letter, they commented on their appreciation for the common line change and the other improvements to environmental stewardship that are represented in the changes to the Shoreline Master Program. So, and I agree. And also appreciation for the Green Necklace connectivity planning that has gone into that, and a number of other really important changes. So I'm satisfied with that. Although I would note there's so many pieces to this. I do think breaking it down into the things that really changed, and again, I personally found the goals and outcomes chart really helpful because it was in a chart form, and it had, this change was made, it was to address this goal, this change was made to address this goal. So that one for me really was super helpful. Okay. Do you have anything else? No? All right, great. Do you have what you need? Do you have any questions for us?
No.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, that was our last order of business then. Our only order of business. We do have announcements. Do you have any announcements? Okay. There being no further business then, this meeting is adjourned at 7:43 p.m. Thank you all.